The August heat in Charlotte had a particular weight to it, the kind that pressed against the windows and made everything inside feel slightly airless. I had come home early from my weekly lunch with a former colleague, cutting the visit short because of a headache I blamed on the humidity. I pushed open the door to my study, reached for the light switch, and stopped. Something was wrong. Nothing dramatic. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. No obvious sign of intrusion. After 31 years as a forensic accountant, the last 12 of which I spent running my own fraud investigation practice, I had learned that real theft rarely announces itself. It arrives in small misalignments, a folder sitting at a slightly different angle, a desk drawer not quite flush with the cabinet face, the rolling chair pushed 3 inches too far to the left. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes move slowly across the room, the way I had trained myself to work a scene. The filing cabinet in the corner held my personal financial documents, tax returns, the deed to the house, retirement account statements, my late wife's life insurance paperwork. The lock bore a faint new scratch at the 7 o'clock position. Amateur work. A bent paperclip or a small flathead screwdriver. My chest tightened, but not with panic. With recognition, I walked to the cabinet and opened it with my own key. Everything was there, but the order was wrong. I kept my documents in reverse chronological sequence, newest on top, oldest in the back. Someone had replaced them with the pages slightly out of order. The 2022 tax return was sitting above the 2023 return. A small mistake, the kind you only make when you're moving quickly, and you're not the one who organized them in the first place. I pulled out the folder containing the deed to my house and held it up to the window light. The deed was intact, but behind it, tucked in a way that suggested someone had placed it there recently rather than filed it deliberately, was a copy of a power of attorney form blank, the kind you could download from a legal website. I put everything back exactly as I had found it, including the out-of-order documents. I did not want anyone to know I had noticed. I sat in my chair for a long moment, pressing my fingertips together the way I always did when I was building a theory, and I let the pieces arrange themselves. My daughter and her husband had moved into the guest suite 14 months ago, just after my wife passed. They had framed it as help for me. I had framed it as convenience for them. They had been paying rent across town, and the housing market had made saving difficult. I told myself the arrangement was temporary and mutually beneficial. The blank power of attorney form suggested they were thinking about something else entirely. Dinner that evening was pot roast, which my daughter made every other Sunday. I took my usual seat at the head of the table and watched them the way I had spent 3 decades watching people who were hiding something. My son-in-law poured the iced tea with slightly too much care, his eyes avoiding mine by just a fraction of a degree more than usual. "Dad," my daughter said, setting a plate in front of me with a warm smile. "We were thinking, you've been talking about taking that trip to see your brother in Tucson. You should just go take a whole week. Derek and I can keep the house running." I picked up my fork and cut a piece of the roast with measured precision. "Have I been talking about that? You mentioned it last month, maybe 2 months ago." I took a bite, chewed slowly. I had mentioned it once briefly in the context of a larger conversation about my brother's health. My daughter had been on her phone for most of that conversation. The fact that she remembered it now and was raising it with this particular energy told me a great deal. "You're right," I said. "I've been putting it off." "It would do you good," my son-in-law said. He had a way of agreeing with whatever my daughter said that had always struck me as either devotion or weakness. That night, it read differently. It read like coordination. "You've been cooped up since the funeral. You deserve a change of scenery." Derek's right. My daughter said, "You've been taking care of everything here alone. Let yourself breathe a little. We'll handle things while you're gone. We'll handle things. The phrase sat at the center of the table between us, like something none of us were looking at directly. I'll think about it, I said. After dinner, I told them I was tired and went to my bedroom. But I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, and I thought about that blank power of attorney form, the scratched cabinet lock, and the way my daughter's voice had brightened to a specific pitch when she suggested I leave for a week. I had heard that pitch in deposition rooms, in boardrooms, in the offices of HR managers who were very eager for the investigation to conclude quickly. It was the pitch of someone who needed something to happen and needed me not to be in the room when it did. I was 62 years old. My house in the Dworth neighborhood of Charlotte had been appraised at $910,000 the previous spring. My wife's life insurance payout was sitting in an investment account. My retirement portfolio had grown for 30 years. Together, it added up to a figure that would change someone's life significantly. It would just have to be mine. I was up before sunrise the next morning, moving through the house quietly while they slept. The mail sat in the basket by the door, 3 pieces. I recognized the envelope from my investment brokerage by the logo, but it was sitting open, the flap pulled back and not properly resealed. I slid the statement out carefully. My daughter's fingerprints were not literally on it, but they might as well have been. Someone had unfolded it and refolded it in a slightly different crease pattern. I photographed it with my phone before putting it back. I spent 2 more days watching. I watched carefully, the way I had watched for 3 decades, cataloging behaviors without assigning meaning prematurely. My son-in-law made 2 phone calls in the backyard in the evenings, stepping outside with his phone turned face in against his hip, the body language of someone concealing a screen. My daughter spent an unusual amount of time in my study during the afternoon hours, when she knew I typically took a walk. I started shortening my walks without telling them, coming home 20 minutes early, and twice I heard the study door close as I came through the front. On the 3rd evening, I told them over dinner that I had called my brother and booked the trip. "Wonderful," my daughter said. Her smile arrived a half-second too fast. "When do you leave?" my son-in-law asked. "Saturday morning. I'll drive. Stay through next Friday. Maybe into the weekend if Gary's feeling up to it." They exchanged a glance across the table. Quick, calibrated, the kind of glance that couples develop over years of shared language. But I had spent my career reading exactly that kind of glance in conference rooms, and what I read in it was relief. "You should leave early to beat the interstate traffic," my daughter said. I told her I would, and then I watched the rest of the meal unfold, watching them relax by increments, their shoulders dropping, their voices easing into something that sounded genuinely warm for the first time in weeks. They were good people who had made a bad decision. That was the hardest part, not the betrayal itself, but the normally around it. Saturday morning, I loaded my Subaru with a duffel bag, my laptop case, and a small cooler. My daughter hugged me in the driveway. My son-in-law carried the cooler to the car and shook my hand. He held it a beat too long, which I had come to recognize as the handshake of a man managing guilt. "Take care of yourself, Dad. I always do." I backed out of the driveway and drove toward the highway. In my rearview mirror, I watched them standing together at the end of the walkway. And at the exact moment my car turned the corner and they believed I could no longer see them, my son-in-law put his arm around my daughter's shoulder and said something that made her laugh. I had not seen her laugh like that in months. I drove to a Hampton Inn 8 miles away near the South Park area and checked in under a credit card connected to an account my daughter did not know existed, a holdover from my private practice days when I had kept finances compartmentalized out of professional habit. The room was standard and anonymous, I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for dark. I had grown up 3 blocks from my current house. I knew the neighborhood the way you only know a place when you've watched it change over decades. Which yards had motion sensors? Which streets were shaded by old oaks that blocked streetlights? Which routes connected without ever touching the main road? At 10:30 that night, I parked on Euclid Avenue and walked the rest of the way in the heavy evening heat. The Hendersons' house, directly across from mine, had been sitting empty since March. Bill Henderson had moved to assisted living after a fall, and his family hadn't yet decided what to do with the property. The spare key was under a ceramic frog by the back door. I knew this because Bill had told me himself years ago, in the way neighbors tell each other things when they trust each other. I let myself in through the back, moved through the dark house without turning on any lights, and settled in the front room with a clear sight line to my own house. Every light in the place was on. Through the front window of my study, I could see my son-in-law moving with a confidence he never showed when I was home. He pulled the filing cabinet open without hesitating. He knew the layout. He had been in there before. My daughter came in carrying a manila folder, and I watched her spread documents across my desk, documents I had not spread there. They had brought their own paperwork. I raised the compact binoculars I had bought that afternoon at a sporting goods store and adjusted the focus. My daughter was holding what appeared to be a multi-page document. I could see the general shape of it, too formal to be correspondence, the layout of a legal form. My son-in-law was leaning over the desk reading. He said something. She said something back. He nodded once, the slow nod of someone accepting a thing they had already accepted weeks ago and are now just confirming. Then a third person arrived. A car I didn't recognize had pulled up while I was watching the study window. I heard the doorbell through the closed front windows of the Henderson house. A woman, mid-50s, professional clothes, despite the late hour, carrying a leather portfolio. My daughter let her in without hesitation and walked her directly toward the study. My hands were steady. I had spent enough time in adversarial situations to know that emotional reactions were useful later. Not now. Now was for documentation. I raised my phone and started photographing through the window. The range was too great for detail, but the timestamps would be real, and the presence of 3 figures in my study at 11 at night was a fact no photograph quality could undermine. I was still watching when a hand touched my shoulder. I turned, expecting anything, and found my neighbor from 2 houses down, Eleanor, 71 years old, a retired school administrator who had lived in the neighborhood since before I was born. She was standing in the Henderson living room in a cotton robe and slippers, holding a glass of iced water like she had simply wandered over to check on someone. "I saw you come in through the back," she said quietly. Her voice carried no alarm, only a kind of steady curiosity. "I watched this block at night. Bill asked me to, Eleanor." I didn't know what else to say. "I know what you're looking at." She moved to stand beside me at the window, looking across the street at the illuminated rooms of my own house. "That woman arrived at 11:15 Tuesday night, too. I have her license plate." She patted the pocket of her robe, a small notepad, the kind from a hotel bedside table. I wrote it down. I stared at her. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that settled into me like a stone into still water. "Because 30 years ago, my own son cleaned out my savings account while I was in the hospital for a hip replacement. I was too embarrassed to say anything." She looked at the notepad in her hand. "I'm not going to watch it happen to someone else and say nothing." I had built my entire career on documentation and professional distance, on the principle that personal feeling had no place in a fraud investigation. Standing in Bill Henderson's dark living room at 11:30 at night, I felt something in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel since my wife died. Not grief and not anger. Exactly. Something quieter and more durable than both. Gratitude. Maybe the unexpected kind. Her name, I said. The woman with the portfolio. Eleanor checked her notepad. Sandra Polk. I looked her up. Real estate agent licensed in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. She paused. She specializes in estate sales. Estate sales. The phrase landed with precision. They were not planning a simple transaction. They were treating my house as something I was already done with. Eleanor produced a second folded paper from her pocket. I wrote down every visit, dates, times, descriptions of anyone who came to the house when your car wasn't there. She held it out. I started keeping the log 3 weeks ago. I noticed things before you did. I took the paper. Her handwriting was the clean, unambiguous script of someone who had spent decades writing on blackboards. 8 separate entries over 3 weeks. Sandra Polk's visits. A man Eleanor described as heavy-set gray hair, arriving once in a pickup truck and spending 40 minutes inside. My son-in-law loading cardboard boxes into his car on a Thursday afternoon. My daughter sitting in the driveway for 20 minutes on a phone call, making notes on a legal pad. I didn't know who to tell, Eleanor said. I was waiting to see if you'd come back early. I didn't come back early, I said. I never left. She looked at me for a long moment, then sat down in one of Bill's armchairs like she had been expecting to stay a while. Then we have work to do. We watched until 2 o'clock in the morning. Sandra Poole left at half midnight, the leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Before she went, I watched through the binoculars as my son-in-law signed something at my desk. My daughter signed after him. Sandra Polk countersigned and slid the documents into her portfolio with the practiced care of someone who had done this many times. I photographed all of it, time-stamped. After the lights in my study went out and the rest of the house settled, Eleanor and I sat in the Henderson living room, and she poured us each a glass of water from the kitchen. I looked at the photographs on my phone. More than 40 images from that night alone. Every one of them a piece of what my former clients used to call a narrative of intent. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked. First, I need to understand the full architecture of it, I said. Then I need to make it impossible to complete. She nodded like this was obvious. You'll need a lawyer. I already have one in mind. I had kept a relationship with a real estate and estate planning attorney named Marcus Webb over the years, referring clients to him and occasionally consulting on fraud matters involving property. He was precise, thorough, and he owed me nothing, which was exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted in a situation like this. I called him the next morning from the hotel room. I didn't explain everything, just enough. A potential unauthorized transaction involving my property. I needed protection in place before anything moved forward. Come in this afternoon, he said. We'll talk about an irrevocable trust. I drove to Marcus's office on Tryon Street at 2 o'clock. He listened to the abbreviated version of what I had observed, asked 4 clarifying questions, and then walked me through the structure of a revocable, living trust converted to irrevocable. If completed and recorded, any power of attorney executed before or after its formation would be functionally meaningless. You cannot execute a transaction against property held in an irrevocable trust by someone who is not the trustee. And I would be the sole trustee. How quickly can this be done? I asked. I can draft it today. File with the county recorder by 5 if we move fast. We moved fast. By 4:47 that afternoon, my house legally existed inside an irrevocable trust. Any power of attorney they had forged, and I now had little doubt that one existed, was worthless. You cannot sell what you don't control. I paid Marcus's fee and drove back to the hotel. I sat at the small desk and organized what I had into folders on my laptop. surveillance photographs, time-stamped, Eleanor's observation log, my own records of the tampered cabinet, the open mail, the blank power of attorney form I had photographed weeks earlier. I called Eleanor from the parking lot. "Keep watching," I told her. "Document anything that happens. I need you to be a witness. If this goes where I think it's going, it'll go there," she said, with the certainty of someone who had seen it before. I drove back to the hotel and gave myself permission to feel for exactly 30 minutes everything I had been suppressing. The anger arrived first clean and hot. Then something more complicated. The sorrow of understanding that my daughter had looked at everything I had built and decided to take it rather than wait for it. I had worked for 31 years. I had put her through college, paid for her wedding, helped them with the down payment on the apartment they had given up when they moved in with me. None of it had been enough to make theft feel wrong to her. When the 30 minutes ended, I put it away. Not forgiven, not forgotten. Filed. I had work to finish. I spent 3 more days watching the house from various vantage points, using Eleanor's place when the Henderson house felt too exposed. I watched Sandra Polk make one more visit on a Wednesday afternoon. I watched a man I now identified through public records as a real estate appraiser spend 2 hours inside on Thursday morning. His truck parked openly in my driveway as if the house were already available for assessment. I photographed all of it. On Thursday evening, I let myself back into the house through the side door while they were at a movie. I had heard them discuss it over the breakfast table, and I had confirmed their departure from down the street. I moved through my own home quickly and efficiently, the way I had moved through the offices of 100 clients over the years, looking for the thing that would complete the picture. I found it in my daughter's nightstand. A file folder she had not thought to lock because she believed I was in Tucson, watching sunsets with my brother. Inside was a copy of the power of attorney, executed, signed, notarized. My name at the bottom, my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. The pen pressure was wrong. The loop at the top of the capital R and my last name was slightly too open. I had been authenticating documents since before she was born, and whoever had forged this had done research without understanding what the research was for. I photographed each page under 3 different lighting conditions. Behind the power of attorney was a purchase and sale agreement. The buyer was listed as an LLC based in Atlanta. The purchase price was $840,000. Cash closing date listed as September 12th. Behind the purchase agreement was a single printed email. I photographed it and read it twice before I fully understood what I was looking at. It was from my daughter to someone she addressed as Ryan, not her husband, a different name entirely. The email was 5 weeks old. It described the plan and the kind of language that people use when they are very confident and very foolish. Casual, warm, detailed. Once the sale closes, I'll transfer half to your account. Derrick thinks we're buying a house upstate. He has no idea I'm leaving. By the time he figures it out, we'll be in Portland. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it and walked out of the room. I sat in my car down the block for a long time, the engine off, the August heat building around me. My son-in-law was going to be destroyed by this. Whatever part he had played in the scheme against me, and his part was real. His signature was on documents. He had stood in my study while a real estate agent spread my own paperwork across my desk. He was also a man being set up to take the blame and the loss simultaneously. He thought they were building something together. She had already booked the flight. The clarity that settled over me was not satisfaction. It was the same cold precision I had felt at the end of every complicated case when the structure of the fraud became fully visible and the only remaining work was execution. I did not feel victorious. I felt like a professional who had gathered sufficient evidence and was now prepared to act. I called Marcus Webb that evening. "I have the full picture," I said. "Forged power of attorney, purchase agreement, evidence of the full scheme. I'm ready. Closing date, September 12th. "Then we let it run," he said. When I didn't respond immediately, he added, "Maximum impact. Let them walk into the closing. They'll have no idea the property is in trust, and the POA is worthless until they're sitting at the table." I had arrived at the same conclusion on my own. What about criminal exposure? Forged power of attorney. Filing a fraudulent instrument with intent to transfer real property. That's a felony in North Carolina under Chapter 14. If they complete any part of the transaction using the forged document, it compounds. I'd bring the evidence to the DA's office before the closing date, get them moving, and then let it all arrive at the same moment. That's how I do it. I said, "I know. That's why I'm recommending it." I returned home on Sunday, 2 days early. Deliberately, I wanted them to see me. I wanted to observe them managing the disruption of my early return, to watch them recalculate timelines and exchange looks and try to hold together the pretense of normal life, while secretly wondering if I had cost them their window. My daughter was in the kitchen when I came through the door. Her face moved through 3 separate expressions in less than 2 seconds. Surprise, concern, calculation, before landing on warmth. "Dad, is everything okay? Is Gary?" "Gary's fine. I just missed home." I set down my duffel bag and looked around the kitchen with the deliberate ease of a man who has been away and is glad to be back. "Something smells good. I was just starting dinner." She was composed. She was very good at composed. "Derek will be home in an hour." "Take your time," I said. "I'm going to unpack." I went to my study and sat in my chair for a long time, not doing anything. Just sitting in the room that had been violated and reclaimed and violated again, thinking about what the next 3 weeks would require of me. I would have to eat dinners at that table. I would have to make conversation. I would have to perform normally with the same consistency they were performing it. And I would have to do it better because I had more practice. That first dinner back was its own kind of theater. My son-in-law arrived home and greeted me with a hug that was slightly too firm, slightly too long. The hug of a man reasserting a relationship he had been mentally dissolving. He asked about my brother, about the drive, about the heat in Arizona. I told him the heat was significant. He said he'd always wanted to visit Sedona. I said he should go sometime. My daughter served the food and kept the conversation moving with the precise energy of someone who needed the evening to feel unremarkable. I helped her. I asked about their week. I mentioned that I had been thinking about getting some deferred maintenance done on the house, the upstairs bathroom, the deck boards that had been softening. My daughter agreed the bathroom had needed attention for a while. Later, after they had gone to their room, I sat in the study in the dark and recorded a voice memo summarizing the evening's observations. It joined 43 other voice memos I had been recording for the past 3 weeks. The days that followed were an exercise in controlled patience. I went to Marcus Webb's office twice more to organize the evidence for the district attorney's package. Eleanor provided a notarized statement of her observations. I provided everything else. Photographs, the chain of custody documentation for every piece of evidence, the timeline organized to the minute, the email between my daughter and Ryan in Atlanta, the forged power of attorney with my comparative signature analysis attached, 3 pages of technical detail documenting precisely why the signature was not mine. I had spent 31 years doing this for other people's disasters. I had never expected to be thorough enough at it to save myself. The 12th of September arrived on a Tuesday. I dressed in the charcoal suit I reserved for depositions and courtrooms. I carried my briefcase, the one I had used since the early years of my practice, worn at the corners in a way that said experience rather than age. I drove to the office of a title company in the South Park area where the closing was scheduled. Through the glass partition at the entrance, I could see them already gathered around the conference table. My daughter and son-in-law on one side, the professional posture of people trying not to look nervous. Sandra Polk at one end, her leather portfolio open on the table, the practiced efficiency of a transaction she expected to close within the hour. An attorney representing the Atlanta buyer at the other end, reviewing documents. Marcus stepped up beside me in the lobby. "Ready?" "Yes." We walked in. The room went quiet the way rooms do when the wrong person enters. My daughter's face drained of color so completely and so quickly that I noted it with clinical detachment. Genuine physiological shock, not performance. My son-in-law stood halfway out of his chair before he caught himself. Sandra Polk looked between me and my daughter, recalibrating rapidly. The buyer's attorney looked at his documents as if they might explain what was happening. I walked to the empty end of the table. I set my briefcase down and opened it. "My name is Robert Calhoun," I said. "I'm the owner of the property you're attempting to purchase today." "This transaction cannot proceed, Dad." My daughter's voice was low and very controlled. "Let's talk about this somewhere. Sandra," I spoke directly to the real estate agent. "The property you have listed for sale was placed in an irrevocable trust on August 14th of this year. I am the sole trustee. Any power of attorney executed before or after that date is legally void with respect to this property. Marcus." Marcus stepped forward and placed a copy of the trust documents, the county recording stamp visible on the first page in front of Sandra Polk. He placed a second copy in front of the buyer's attorney. "Additionally," I continued, "the power of attorney on which this transaction is premised is a forgery." I removed a folder and placed it on the table. "This is a comparative analysis of my authentic signature against the signature on the document you have. I prepared this analysis personally. I hold certifications in forensic document examination. The document is not valid." The buyer's attorney picked up the trust filing and read it quickly. "When was this recorded?" "August 14th. 4 weeks ago." He set it down and looked at Sandra Polk. "This sale cannot close. The seller has no authority to convey." Sandra Polk was looking at my daughter. Something was moving across her face, the arithmetic of liability, the calculation of exactly how much of this she had known and how much she had chosen not to verify. "I was provided documentation." "You were provided a forged power of attorney," Marcus said, with the precise neutrality of someone who has been in rooms like this many times. "Your due diligence obligation included a title search that would have revealed the trust. The recording is public and was available from the date of filing." My son-in-law found his voice. It was very thin. "We can fix this. We can sit down and there is nothing to fix," I said. I kept my voice level. I had promised myself I would keep my voice level. What exists is a forged legal instrument bearing my name. That is a felony. The district attorney's office received my evidence package 2 weeks ago. I expect you'll be hearing from them. The silence in that room had a specific texture. I had heard it before. In the final minutes of depositions, when the weight of evidence becomes undeniable, and the defendant understands there is no remaining version of events that helps them. It was the silence of reckoning. My son-in-law turned to my daughter. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "What email? What did he mean about an email?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were on the table. "There is correspondence," Marcus said, "between your wife and a third party in Atlanta, outlining a plan to transfer the proceeds of this sale to a private account and depart the state. You were not informed of this plan." He looked at my daughter for a long time. Then he looked at me and something in his face collapsed. Not dramatically, the way a structure falls when the foundational support is removed. He had believed he was taking something from me. He had not known he was also being taken from. I felt no satisfaction in that. I had not prepared for it to move me the way it did. I gathered my documents and placed them back in my briefcase, each folder in its proper order. The buyer's attorney was on his phone, already walking toward the door. Sandra Polk was closing her portfolio, her face carrying the particular expression of a professional who understands they have several very unpleasant phone calls ahead of them. "The title company will need to void all documents associated with this transaction," Marcus said to the room at large. "I'll coordinate with your office directly." I walked to the door. My daughter said my name once quietly, with something in it that I hadn't heard in a long time. Not calculation or performance, just the voice of a person who had gone very far in a direction and suddenly found themselves alone at the end of it. I stopped with my hand on the doorframe. I did not turn around. "I paid for your education," I said. "I helped with your apartment deposit. I let you move into my home because I thought you needed help, and I was your family. You looked at all of that and decided it wasn't enough." I paused. "The district attorney will be in contact. I'd recommend getting an attorney who specializes in white-collar defense. Marcus can give you a referral if needed." I walked out into the September heat. Marcus caught up to me in the parking lot. We stood beside my car for a moment, the late summer sun sitting hard on the blacktop. "The DA moves forward from here," he said. "Forgery of a legal instrument. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Your daughter faces the greater exposure because of the email evidence that establishes premeditation and personal financial motive independent of her husband. His attorney will likely argue he was following her lead. I know I said he was. That may mitigate his exposure somewhat, not eliminate it. I know that too." Marcus looked at me carefully. "How are you?" "I'm standing up." "That's something." I drove to Eleanor's house before going home. She was in the front garden, a wide-brimmed hat against the afternoon sun, clipping back the overgrown rosemary along her front walkway. She looked up when she heard my car and read the answer in my face before I said a word. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She pulled off her gardening gloves and tucked them in her pocket. "Come inside. I'll make iced tea." We sat at her kitchen table, the way neighbors sit who have known each other long enough to skip the formalities. She didn't ask for details. She seemed to understand that the details were not the point right now. "She'll reach out eventually," Eleanor said. "They usually do. Maybe," I said. "Will you answer?" I thought about that for a while. The weight of 31 years of work that had taught me exactly how to build the case that had brought this day to its conclusion. The weight of a marriage and a daughter and a house full of photographs and ceramic things my wife had collected that were still sitting exactly where she had placed them. The weight of the choice I had made, which was not a simple choice, even when it was the right one. "I'll have to see who calls," I said finally, the daughter I raised, or whoever she became when she started planning this. Eleanor nodded like she understood the distinction, and I believed she did. The legal process moved forward with the methodical pace of institutional machinery. The district attorney's office filed charges on a Monday morning in late October. Forgery of a legal instrument, conspiracy to commit real property fraud, filing a fraudulent instrument. My daughter and her attorney entered negotiations. My son-in-law, whose attorney successfully argued diminished culpability given the email evidence, reached a plea agreement that involved community service, a substantial fine, and restitution. My daughter did not take a plea, she contested. The trial was brief. The evidence was organized the way I had organized evidence for 3 decades. Tight, chronological, fully documented, cross-referenced, and time-stamped. The outcome was not in doubt from the day the evidence was filed. I attended the sentencing hearing the way I had attended 50 others over the course of my career, sitting in the gallery rather than at the counsel table, watching the process I had always served from the outside. The judge read from my victim impact statement without looking up from the page. 31 years as a forensic accountant, a daughter provided every advantage. A forgery sophisticated enough to fool many people, and not quite sophisticated enough to fool me. The sentence was 2 years of supervised probation, community service, and full restitution. No prison time given the absence of prior criminal history. The gavel came down. I left before she turned around. On the drive home through the October afternoon, the Charlotte streets carrying the particular golden light of early fall, I thought about the version of the story where I had not come home early that August afternoon, where I had not noticed the filing cabinet scratches or the misaligned documents, where I had believed the power of attorney was real and the process had run its course before I understood what had been taken. I thought about all the people for whom that version of the story had been their reality. The clients I had seen over 30 years who came to me too late after the trust account was emptied, or the deed was transferred, or the estate was liquidated without authorization. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment. The house looked exactly the same as it had looked every day for 20 years. Same front walk, same oak by the mailbox that had grown so large we had considered removing it, and then never did. Same curtains in the front window that my wife had chosen from a catalog on a Sunday afternoon many years ago. It was still mine. I had kept it. That was not a small thing. I had lost my daughter, or the version of her, who had decided that what I had built was more valuable than who I was. That loss was real, and it would continue to be real for a long time, maybe always. I did not pretend otherwise. I had stood in front of other people's losses for 3 decades and told them that documentation and evidence and legal process were tools, not remedies. You did not use them to fix what was broken. You used them to draw a boundary around the wreckage so that it did not spread further. I had drawn the boundary. I called my brother Gary in Tucson that evening and told him most of it. He listened without interrupting, which had always been one of his best qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come visit." "Actually, this time I will." I said, "I'll come in the spring." I made coffee, opened my laptop, and spent an hour researching elder financial exploitation prevention programs in Charlotte. There was work to be done that had nothing to do with my own case. Organizations that needed people with my background to help identify fraud before it completed, to advise on the documentation practices that made the difference between a case that could be prosecuted and one that couldn't. People who had spent their lives building something and needed someone who understood the mechanics of how it could be taken from them. They had tried to make me a victim. I had refused. The refusal was not dramatic. It did not arrive with a speech or a confrontation or a moment of triumph. It arrived the morning I came home early from lunch, stood in the doorway of my own study, and let 31 years of professional experience override the impulse to disbelieve what I was seeing. I had believed the evidence. That was all, and it had been enough. If you found this story meaningful, please like and subscribe to Ember Vengeance and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support allows these stories to reach people who need to hear them.